Peril of knowing too much, when self-knowledge becomes a trap. For centuries, philosophers and psychologists alike have championed self-knowledge as the ultimate human achievement. From the Socratic know thyself to the depths of Freudian analysis, the journey inward has always been seen as the path to authenticity, freedom, and personal growth. But what if this sacred quest, pushed too far, becomes a gilded cage? Carl Jung, the pioneering Swiss psychiatrist, dared to ask this uncomfortable question. He understood, perhaps more deeply than anyone, that there's a silent, devastating risk hidden within this introspective dive. Excessive introspection. A point where looking inward ceases to illuminate and begins to blind. Jung realized that the human soul isn't just a serene inner landscape to be explored. It's a living, unpredictable force, capable of swallowing the ego whole in its relentless attempt to control and categorize. His own autobiography, memories, dreams, reflections, recounts chilling moments when he nearly lost his sanity, confronting the raw, archetypal images that surged from his unconscious. He didn't romanticize this deep dive. He warned against it. The unconscious, he cautioned, isn't a secret garden where you simply gather flowers of wisdom. It's a dense, dangerous wilderness where venturing without a map means you might never find your way out. And this precisely is where the danger lies. When an individual, driven by an insatiable thirst to understand their own essence, dives so deep they lose contact with the world around them, they begin to live more in symbols than in relationships, more in abstract concepts than in real affection, more in analysis than in lived experience. They isolate themselves, yet convince themselves they're evolving. They feel superior, yet fail to see they're merely inflated. And when they finally try to return to the world, they discover they no longer know how to connect. Everything around them now seems trivial in the face of their own vast, complex psyche. This video is a deep dive into the breaking point between healthy introspection and a destructive obsession with the self. It's a boundary Jung not only studied in his patients but intimately experienced himself. Here, we'll explore how the process of self-knowledge, when taken to the extreme, can morph into a sophisticated form of intellectual narcissism. We'll unpack how the attempt to integrate the shadow can turn into a perverse cult of one's own abyss, and how the noble quest for authenticity can paradoxically create an artificial personality, utterly disconnected from lived reality. Let's be clear, this isn't an attack on self-knowledge. It's a crucial call for balance. It's a direct, necessary warning for those who confuse genuine self-discovery with self-absorption. Because as Jung demonstrated with his own life, knowing yourself isn't about mastering your soul. It's about learning to alive with it, without trying to dissect it layer by painful layer. Sometimes, true maturity lies not in understanding every single thing about who we are, but in accepting that some parts of us must remain mysterious. Because life isn't just about consciousness, it also demands spontaneity, surrender, and authentic connection. And those who know themselves too well may just forget what it truly means to live. Jung's descent, a personal reckoning. To truly grasp the dangers of extreme self-knowledge, we must follow Carl Gustav Jung's harrowing journey into the heart of his own psyche. A crossing that wasn't theoretical, but lived with an almost unbearable intensity. After his profound break with Sigmund Freud, Jung plunged into what he described as a period of confrontation with the unconscious. This was an experience that deliberately distanced him from the external world, immersing him in a deep, intense, and at times, terrifying inner dive. During this period, Jung temporarily abandoned his clinical practice and dedicated himself to a radical form of self-analysis. He meticulously recorded dreams, visions, impulses, and feelings, not to control them, but to understand them in their raw symbolic language. It was during these years that he painstakingly crafted the Red Book, an intimate chronicle of his inner journey, filled with archetypal images, dialogues with symbolic figures, and dramatic representations of what he termed images of the unconscious. Few psychologists have gone as far in this process, and even fewer have returned with their sanity intact. Jung vividly described how these experiences brought him to the very brink of madness. In memories, dreams, reflections, he recounted often not knowing whether what he saw and heard was real or mere delusion. He began to realize that within himself lived multiple voices, internal characters demanding to be heard and respected. And while many of these internal contents brought profound insights into human nature, there was a heavy price to be paid, the constant, terrifying risk of psychic disintegration. This wasn't just about interpreting symbols or understanding traumas. It was a direct confrontation with the primordial forces of the unconscious, with the archetypes that fundamentally shaped the human psyche. Jung realized that by awakening these powerful forces, an individual risks being possessed by them. The persona, your social mask, begins to dissolve. The ego weakens and the self, that totalizing instance of the psyche, can become so overwhelming that the subject loses their fundamental sense of individuality. This is what he famously called ego inflation. It occurs when a person, upon coming into contact with powerful archetypal aspects of themselves, begins to believe they are special, enlightened, or somehow above others. They confuse a deep internal experience with personal superiority. Jung emerged from this experience transformed, but far from unscathed. He knew that few could endure what he had endured, and for this reason, he began to warn about the dangers of blindly exploring the unconscious. Self-knowledge, he insisted, must be cultivated with profound humility and vigilance, because the unconscious is not neutral territory. It is a living power with its own intentions, its own rhythms, and it simply does not tolerate arrogance. From this harrowing crossing, Jung formulated the bedrock of his analytical psychology. But more than theories, he left a testament. Deep self-knowledge is a dangerous task. It can lead to integration, but also to fragmentation. It can generate wisdom, but also delusion. What determines this outcome is not the depth of introspection, but your ability to keep one foot firmly planted in reality while descending into the symbolic hell of the soul. The illusion of grandeur, ego inflation. There's an even more critical point in this inner journey, a moment where the ego, instead of dissolving into madness, expands in a distorted, dangerous way, creating an illusion of psychological power and self-anointed greatness. This is the realm of ego inflation. When Jung coined the term ego inflation, he wasn't talking about common vanity or simple pride. He was referring to a far more subtle and insidious phenomenon, the moment when the ego, upon coming into contact with profound contents of the unconscious, especially those of an archetypal nature, begins to identify with them. The individual ceases to be just a person trying to understand themselves and starts to genuinely believe they are a bearer of universal truths, a conduit for cosmic wisdom. They confuse a powerful symbolic experience with a personal spiritual mission. And in that moment, self-knowledge morphs into a profound illusion of grandeur. Imagine someone who dives deeply into their own psyche, uncovers profound symbols, ancient patterns, and hidden messages. Then, they begin to believe they have access to a type of knowledge reserved only for the awakened. Enchanted by their own inner journey, this person starts to speak as if they were an oracle. They'll use complex psychological terms to explain everything and everyone. They assume the posture of a mentor or healer, without having truly transformed internally. They haven't integrated the contents of the unconscious. They've been seduced by them. And the most dangerous part, they don't even realize it. For Jung, this state is as dangerous as the outright repression of the unconscious. The inflated ego meticulously constructs a persona, a public mask, based on powerful archetypes. The wise one, the healer, the visionary, the martyr. But this is all a facade. Behind this elevated image exists a fragile, insecure ego, constantly hungry for validation. This isn't strength, it's compensation. The individual hasn't become more conscious. They've merely replaced their old identity with a spiritualized fantasy. They no longer alive, they I perform. And the more they perform, the further they drift from their authentic soul. This phenomenon is surprisingly common in people who study psychology, philosophy, or spirituality without practical, grounding experience. They become incredibly skilled at naming internal processes, at symbolically explaining their pains, traumas, and conflicts. But they lose the ability to I feel them. They intellectualize everything, effectively anesthetizing the raw experience of life with refined vocabulary. They create a psychological bubble where everything has a deep, profound meaning, but nothing is truly lived. There's no surrender, only analysis. No transformation, only discourse. Jung observed this in his own patients, and critically in himself. That's why he constantly emphasized the absolute importance of humility on the individuation journey. He knew that contact with the unconscious can inflate us with profound meanings, but only concrete experience, real relationships, and everyday challenges can keep us anchored to reality. Without this vital anchor, the individual simply floats, adrift in a world of symbols that no longer connect to life. And when this happens, they inevitably disconnect from others. Because ego inflation isn't just an internal distortion. It's a massive obstacle to empathy, genuine dialogue, and meaningful coexistence. Those who feel superior stop listening. Those who believe they have exclusive access to hidden truths find it nearly impossible to sustain an honest, open conversation. Gradually, the person inflated by excessive self-knowledge becomes socially isolated. Not because they've been rejected, but because they no longer recognize value in simple human experiences. They think of themselves as beyond the mundane. But in reality, they're just profoundly alone. And it's precisely this loneliness that marks the next, even more devastating stage of inner collapse. Not an hermit, a self-imposed prison. This is the condition of the modern hermit, an individual consumed by their own psychic universe, losing the fundamental ability to connect with the world around them. The process of deep self-knowledge, when taken to the extreme, can lead an individual to a state of emotional and social isolation that Jung described with chilling precision. It's a loneliness that doesn't arise from external rejection, but from a profound internal separation, a distancing from the world caused by an overwhelming attention to one's own psychic universe. The subject disconnects not because the world has excluded them, but because they themselves have voluntarily ceased to inhabit it. Jung observed that many who dive too deeply into introspection end up developing what we might call pathological self-absorption, a kind of prison of mirrors where everything perceived revolves around the self. Every gesture, every emotion, every word, every relationship becomes mere material to be analyzed, interpreted, and ciphered. Spontaneity becomes suspect, chance is feared, and human interactions are experienced with a certain clinical detachment. Life itself loses its fluidity. Each encounter is an experiment, each emotion a symptom. This type of individual may appear calm, centered, even profound, but they are often emotionally frozen. They live in a perpetual watchtower, observing themselves constantly, trying to control every impulse, every reaction, every thought. The search for balance turns into an obsession with stability. The fear of repeating unconscious patterns prevents them from living fully. And the more they try to protect themselves from themselves, the more they isolate themselves from others. The problem is, this isolation isn't always experienced as immediate suffering. On the contrary, for many, It emerges as a conscious refuge, a sanctuary where they can finally be their true self, free from the chaos of the world. But over time, this refuge inevitably reveals itself to be a disguised prison. The absence of real relationships begins to silently corrode the soul. The lack of genuine human contact, of conflict, of true affection, even of everyday banality, makes existence sterile. The individual lives in a permanent state of observation, but no longer knows what it means to genuinely feel something. Jung understood that human beings don't realize themselves solely through introspection, but primarily through relationship. It's in the encounter with the other, with alterity, that the unconscious truly reveals itself, that complexes are activated, that the shadow appears, and that true growth occurs. A psyche that is never challenged by other psyches becomes narcissistic, not in the vulgar sense of the term, but in the clinical sense. The external world loses its value, and everything begins to revolve around one's own reflection. This isolation doesn't just affect the emotional field, it corrodes vitality itself. People who were once curious, creative, expressive, become apathetic, disinterested, excessively rational. Life transforms into a process of merely maintaining consciousness, as if the only goal were not to get lost, rather than to actually live. Jung warned that total consciousness is unbearable, and that human beings absolutely need zones of shadow, mystery, and forgetfulness to remain psychologically healthy. The problem of the modern hermit isn't silence, it's sterility, paralysis by analysis, the trap of hyper-reflection. But this process doesn't stop there. When isolation prolongs, and the individual loses the ability to trust their own spontaneity, a new, even more insidious stage emerges, the paralysis of hyper-reflection. A state where every action is preceded by doubt, every emotion is suspect, and every internal movement is dissected before it's even lived. At first glance, self-reflection seems like a clear sign of maturity. The capacity for self-analysis is often seen as an evolutionary achievement of the mind, a trait that separates the human from the purely instinctual. But what happens when this reflection becomes excessive, compulsive, endless? Carl Jung observed that there is a critical point where analysis ceases to be a tool of awareness and becomes a profound form of defense against life itself. This is the perilous territory of hyper-reflection, a state where the individual becomes an eternal observer of themselves, utterly unable to act without first dissecting every single motivation, emotion, or intention. People trapped in this state don't live, they monitor. Every impulse is analyzed until it loses its strength. Every desire is examined in the harsh light of the shadow, the archetype, the complex. And for that reason, it's deactivated. The subject transforms into a bureaucrat of their own psyche, organizing internal files with obsessive precision, but never leaving the control room. It's a form of psychological perfectionism where nothing can be done until everything is understood. And as the human soul is inexhaustible, that moment of complete understanding never arrives. This paralysis isn't just mental. It tragically affects the body, relationships, and life projects. The person thinks so much about what they actually feel that they no longer genuinely feel. They question their intentions so much they cannot make simple decisions. They evaluate their reactions so much they no longer know if they're being authentic or just rehearsing an ideal response. Life becomes a minefield of possibilities, where each step is preceded by infinite internal simulations of what can happen. The fear is no longer of making mistakes, it's of acting at all. Jung believed that the psyche absolutely needs movement, flow, and action. When it becomes static, rigid, and turned only inward, it begins to devour itself. Thought feeds on thought. Analysis generates more analysis, and instead of liberating, it imprisons. This becomes a lit lamp in a locked room, always illuminating the same walls. There's no progress, no risk, no surprise, just endless rumination. Paradoxically, This state can be fueled by the very search for authenticity. The subject desperately wants to act according to their true self, wants to make conscious choices, wants to avoid repeating old patterns. But this legitimate desire to live with more clarity is hijacked by an unconscious perfectionism, which turns every simple step into an obligation to be deep, meaningful, archetypal. Life loses its freshness. Spontaneity becomes suspect. The simple is devalued. The cruelest consequence of this hyper-reflection is the gradual loss of self-confidence. Everything becomes a reason for doubt. Is this feeling true? Is this will from the ego or the self? Is this desire authentic or an unconscious compensation? In this labyrinth of questions, the person distances themselves further from the direct, messy experience of life. They feel hunger, but don't eat. They feel the urge to hug, but hesitate. They have brilliant ideas, but never execute them. The world transforms into an abstraction. Jung knew that the mind needs pause, forgetfulness, surrender. The soul, he said, doesn't just want to be understood. It wants to be lived. And for that, courage is necessary. Courage to err, to improvise, to act without knowing all the answers. Because it is in the iacte, not in the analysis, that life truly transforms. Embracing the mystery, the wisdom of not knowing. It is precisely at this point that Jung offers us one of his most valuable and often counterintuitive teachings. The importance of mystery, of that which simply cannot be fully understood or explained. In an era where everything needs to be named, understood and explained, Carl Jung invites us to a radically opposite stance, to accept that there are profound dimensions of the soul that should not be fully unveiled. Paradoxically, preserving parts of oneself in silence can be the deepest form of awareness. Instead of trying to illuminate every dark corner of the psyche, Jung proposes something almost heretical to modern thought: to cultivate mystery as an essential part of psychological health. He understood that human beings need shadow as much as they need light. He knew that the unknown within us isn't merely a residue of ignorance, but an active source of vitality, imagination, and transformation. Consciousness, as valuable as it is, has its inherent limits. When we exceed those limits in an attempt to control every nuance of our psyche, we risk destroying what makes it truly alive. Its enigmatic, wild character. Jung realized that the unconscious isn't just a repository of repressed traumas. It's also a boundless reservoir of symbols, intuitions, and creative impulses that cannot and should not be completely tamed by reason. By trying to rationalize everything, the individual stifles their innate capacity to create, to love, to surrender to the beautiful unpredictability of existence. It is at this point that self-knowledge, instead of making us freer, begins to cage us. The person starts to live within a symbolic grid, where every act must have a profound meaning. Every emotion must be meticulously traced back to its archetypal origin, and every relationship must be interpreted in light of psychodynamics. The mystery disappears, and with the disappearance of mystery, the profound fascination for life also vanishes. Jung warned that not everything in us should be exposed to the unrelenting light of consciousness. Some aspects need to remain in the shadows to maintain their symbolic strength and their vital connection to the sacred. He saw this clearly in his own experiences with the unconscious. In memories, dreams, reflections, he recounted that many of his most impactful dreams and visions could not, and should not be explained in rational language. They were experiences that demanded reverence and respect, not dissection. The soul, he said, wants to be touched, not dissected. There is a deep intelligence in not wanting to understand everything, in allowing certain feelings, impulses, and dreams to remain as living enigmas within us, because it is in the space of the unknown that imagination breathes. It is in mystery that the soul finds its nourishment. When everything is interpreted, labeled, and classified, there is little room left for wonder, for enchantment, for surprise. And a psyche without surprise is a dying psyche. Knowing parts of oneself in the dark isn't regression. It's profound maturity. It's knowing that absolute control of the mind is a fantasy, a dangerous illusion. True psychic balance doesn't come from knowing everything about yourself, but from knowing enough to live with presence, integrity, and radical openness to the unexpected. Jung teaches us that the human soul is not an object to be dominated, but a sacred territory to be inhabited with reverence. But how do we live this in practice? How do we know when we're gaining self-knowledge to live better, and when we're merely using it as an escape from life itself? Self-knowledge as a compass, not a destination. How do we find that crucial balance between consciousness and surrender, between rigorous analysis and joyful spontaneity? In this final chapter, we'll tackle that essential synthesis. Self-knowledge as a powerful tool, not an end in itself. At the end of his long, remarkable journey as a psychiatrist, thinker, and relentless seeker, Carl Gustav Jung arrived at a conclusion that boldly contradicts much of our modern obsession with introspection. Self-knowledge is not an end in itself. It's merely a tool. One of the most powerful tools, yes, but still a tool. A means to live better, not a substitute for life itself. This is the crucial point that so many miss when they dive too deep into analysis, personality tests, archetypal maps, and family patterns. They truly believe the goal is to completely understand oneself, as if there were a definitive finish line in the marathon of consciousness. Jung shows us that there isn't one. Knowing oneself is a stage, important, profound, and demanding. But it only makes sense if it's followed by something even more challenging, wiving. Putting that hard-won knowledge to the service of reality, in human relationships, in creativity, in love, in pain, in failure. Self-knowledge that doesn't lead to life becomes a gilded cage, an intellectual masturbation, a mere simulation of evolution. It produces people who know everything about their traumas, but still don't know how to apologize, who understand their complexes but can't listen without interrupting, who have memorized the names of their archetypes, but have lost the ability to improvise, laugh, and make mistakes. True psychological maturity, for Jung, isn't in knowing every single thing that inhabits your soul. It's in living with integrity, even in the face of what you don't yet understand. It's in being able to act, even without certainty. In loving, even without mastering all of your internal mechanisms. In being able to surrender to the present moment without needing to label it. Because in the end, wisdom isn't measured by the quantity of concepts you accumulate, but by the depth of your commitment to reality. That's why Jung said that individuation, this lifelong process of becoming who you truly are, isn't completed on the therapist's couch, nor within the pages of dusty books. It manifests in the raw, messy way you respond to life, in how you face loss, how you treat others when you're frustrated, how you deal with boredom, fear, desire. It's in how you transform knowledge into tangible action. This video has been an invitation to a deep reflection on the limits and very real dangers of self-knowledge. A powerful warning for those who might be using the inner journey as an excuse to avoid real life. But it's also a powerful affirmation. It's easy possible to find balance. It's easy possible to know yourself enough to live with more presence and still keep the mystery alive. To maintain space for doubt, for the sacred, for the spontaneous. Because deep down, that's what keeps us truly human. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt like you were getting lost in too much self-analysis? Have you gone through a moment when you felt you knew too much about yourself, yet still couldn't act? Comment below. Your experience can help countless others who are also facing this dilemma. And if this video impacted you, brought you clarity, or even bothered you, fantastic. That means you're on the right path. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and share this with anyone you know who needs to hear it. And keep watching. The next video is important. Perhaps more than you imagine.